Various tribes of the Belgae and other Gauls are sending emissaries, suing for peace with the Romans. It's looking good. But here's where it starts to get interesting. One tribe in particular, the Nervii, refused to do so. Here's Caesar on the Nervii. On the borders of the Ambiani, the men of Amiens, lived the Nervii. And when Caesar inquired as to the nature and character of these men, he discovered as follows. Traders had no means of access to them, for the Nervii allowed no wine nor any of the other appurtenances of luxury to be imported, because they supposed that their spirit was like to be enfeebled, and their courage relaxed thereby. Fierce men they were, of a great courage, denouncing and accusing the rest of the Belgae for surrendering to Rome and casting away the courage of their forefathers. For themselves, they affirmed that they would send no deputies and accept no terms of peace. End quote. Remember, they're already at war, so anything goes now, more or less. And the Nervii have brought along some of their neighbors, too, into resisting. So Caesar gets to work. And he marches several days into the territory of the Nervii, and he sends ahead some scouts to find a good place for a kind of longer-term camp. And he starts marching toward it. Now, he's got in his army at this point a number of the Belgae who had surrendered, and other Gauls, too, marching with him. And some of these, it turns out, are still quietly rooting for the Belgae to defeat the Romans, and they send word to the Nervii secretly. They say, Caesar's column is spread out like a long, weak string. He's got baggage trains separating all the legions. It would be really easy to take him by surprise here. So the Nervii decide to set up an ambush. And note how Caesar sets that whole narrative arc up nicely, builds some suspense, helps you to understand the Nervii's motivations, their probable strategy. And here's Caesar with more on what the Nervii are getting ready with. Quote, the plan proposed by those who brought the information was further assisted by an ancient practice of the Nervii. Having no strength in cavalry, for even to this day they care nothing for cavalry, but all their power lies in the strength of their infantry, in order more easily to hamper the cavalry of their neighbors, whenever these make a raid on them, they cut into young saplings and bend them over. So they're kind of terraforming here, bending over these young saplings that then grow sideways. And thus, by the thick horizontal growth of boughs and by intertwining with them brambles and thorns, they contrive that these wall-like hedges serve for them as though fortifications, which not only cannot be penetrated, but not even seen through. End quote. So you've got to imagine the Nervii sneaking around behind these impenetrable hedge walls, scheming as the Romans are marching through, unawares, and they wait until Caesar is setting up his camp before they strike. But first, Caesar's going to describe the topography for you of what turns out to be an epic battle that they're about to fight. He says, quote, the character of the ground selected by our officers for the camp was as follows. There was a hill inclining with uniform slope from its top down to the river Sambra. This is the Sabis in Latin. From the opposite riverside, there rose another hill of like slope over against and confronting the other, open land for about 200 paces at its base, then wooded in its upper half, so that it could not easily be seen through from outside. Within those woods, the enemy kept themselves in hiding. On the open ground along the opposite riverbank, a few enemy cavalry posts were to be seen. The depth of the river was about 3 feet. End quote. So Caesar sees a few enemy cavalry across the river where he wants to make his camp, and I guess these must be some of the allies of the Nervii who don't completely ignore the art of horsemanship. And so he sends his cavalry ahead across the shallow river to engage, to chase those enemy cavalry away while he's building a fort on the hill. And the enemy cavalry engage for a while, then they retreat to the forest. Then the Roman cavalry don't follow them. They keep strict discipline. And then the enemy come back out, and then they fade back into the forest. And This goes on for a little while and seems kind of pretty routine here. And there's a key twist here. Caesar says, quote, "However, the arrangement and order of Caesar's column," again, he's speaking in the third person as he always does, "the arrangement and order of Caesar's column was different from the report given by the Belgae to the Nervii. For as he was approaching the enemy, Caesar, according to his custom, was moving with 6 legions in light field order. After them he had placed the baggage of the whole army. Then the 2 legions, which had been last enrolled, brought up the rear of the whole column and formed the baggage guard." End quote. And so, in other words, Caesar's not marching with his army all strung out and individual legions' baggage trains stuck between the legions like squishy vegetables on a shish kebab, but rather he had 6 legions, his stronger ones, veteran ones, all in the front, basically ready to fight. They're in light field order, which means, they're not carrying really heavy packs, and they're ready to fight. Then after them, he's got all of the army baggage together. And then the new recruits are at the back defending the baggage train. And if he hadn't done this, that is, if he hadn't been basically ready to fight off the march, well, let's just say world history might have gone very differently. So the Romans, they arrive, hyper-organized as usual. Immediately, straight away, once they get to the hill, they start marking their camp grounds out, measuring off where the walls are going to be and the road, the streets within the camp. They start chopping down trees, digging ditches. And they haven't been at this for very long when the Nervii suddenly strike. And they struck right as the scouts saw the baggage train start to pull up off in the distance. So it hasn't been very long. The Nervii sweep down out of the forest. From the hill on the other side of the river, tens of thousands of men. They completely overwhelm the Roman cavalry who are on the other side of the bank. They chase them back across the river, and then all these men start sprinting up the hill to the Romans, who have already shifted out of soldier mode and into construction company mode. And here's Caesar on what happens next. Quote, "Caesar had to do everything at once. He had to raise the flag to give the sign to call soldiers to arms, to have the trumpet blow the battle signal, to recall the troops from their entrenching, to bring in the men who had gone somewhat farther afield in search of materials for the ramp. He had the line to form, the troops to harangue, the signal to give. A great part of these duties was prevented by the shortness of the time and the advance of the enemy. So he's not actually able to do all these things. The stress of the moment was relieved by 2 things, the knowledge and experience of the troops, for their training in previous battles enabled them to assess for themselves what was proper to be done as readily as others could have shown them. Remember, these are veterans mostly. And the fact that Caesar had forbidden the several lieutenant generals, the legates he means, to leave the entrenching and their proper legions until the camp was fortified. These generals, seeing the nearness and speed of the enemy, waited no more for a command from Caesar, but took on their own account what steps seemed proper to them." End quote. Okay, so you've got masses of very motivated, tall men coming in hot. Everybody in the Roman side is starting to get very nervous. But the soldiers and officers, they hold their ground. They brace for the attack. Here's what Caesar himself does. Quote, "Caesar gave the necessary commands and then ran down to whatever unit happened to be the closest, and came to the 10th Legion. The trusty 10th. His harangue to the troops was no more than a charge to bear in mind their traditional valor, not to panic, and to bravely withstand the onslaught of the enemy. Then, as the enemy were no farther off than the range of a missile, he gave the signal to engage." End quote. Now, what he says to these men should be pretty obvious to them, right? This is what you should do. Be brave, don't panic. But it really matters that the commander says this. It really matters that they hear it from his mouth. And the words that he uses here, too, are really well chosen. He says, "Remember your traditional valor." The Latin there is pristina virtus, and that could be translated as ancient manliness. Virtus in Latin, it could be translated as virtue in some contexts, could also be battle prowess, but it's also really the best Latin translation of our concept of manliness. And then the connotations of pristina there, pristine, the traditional and traditional valor. In Latin, pristina there really evokes the ancestral age of Roman Republican greatness, the virtue of the past generations who defeated Hannibal, Pyrrhus, the Cimbri, Teutones, other great enemies. And he's reminding them, he's telling them with those two words who they are, appealing to their identity